The first time I visited the battlefield, it was a crisp autumn morning. The leaves had turned a burnt orange, carpeting the ground like a natural tapestry. As a historian, I'd spent countless hours poring over books, studying maps, and tracing the footsteps of soldiers long gone. But this battlefield, tucked away in the rolling hills of rural Pennsylvania, was different. It had a reputation, whispered among my colleagues, of being haunted. The Battle of Ravenswood was one of the bloodiest clashes in the American Civil War. Thousands of soldiers had perished here, their bodies left to decay under the relentless sun before being hastily buried in mass graves. The land bore the scars of conflict, craters from cannon fire, remnants of trenches, and the eerie silence that followed a massacre. I arrived with my usual gear, a notebook, a camera, and a digital recorder. My goal was to document the site, hoping to uncover new insights that could bring history to life for future generations. Little did I know how literal that goal would become. As I walked through the field, I could almost hear the echoes of the past. The wind whispered through the trees, and for a moment it sounded like distant gunfire. I brushed it off as my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, I was standing on ground soaked with history, where the air seemed to buzz with unspoken stories. My first stop was the old stone farmhouse that had served as a makeshift hospital during the battle. The walls were crumbling, and ivy had begun to reclaim the structure. Stepping inside, I felt a chill, despite the mild weather. The floor was strewn with debris, broken furniture, shards of glass, and tattered remnants of medical supplies. The air was thick with the scent of decay and something else, something I couldn't quite place. I set up my recorder on a dusty table and began speaking into it, detailing the history of the farmhouse and its significance in the battle. As I spoke, I felt a strange sensation, as if I were being watched. I turned around quickly, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty, just shadows dancing in the dim light. Continuing my exploration, I ventured upstairs to what had once been the attic. The wooden beams creaked under my weight, and dust motes swirled in the air. I found a small window that overlooked the battlefield. The view was hauntingly beautiful, with the rolling hills bathed in the soft glow of the afternoon sun. I decided to take a break and set up my camera to capture the scene. As I adjusted the lens, I noticed something odd. In the distance, near the tree line, there was a faint, shimmering figure. It looked like a soldier, dressed in tattered Union blues, standing motionless. My heart raced as I tried to focus the camera, but just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. Shaking my head, I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew better. This battlefield held more than just the memories of the past. It held the spirits of those who had fought and died here, their souls forever bound to the land. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the field, I decided to head back to my car. The air had grown colder and the sense of unease had returned. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. Suddenly I heard a faint whisper, barely audible over the rustling leaves. It was a voice filled with pain and desperation, calling out a name I couldn't quite catch. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat, and the shadows around me seemed to deepen, taking on a life of their own. I turned on my heel and hurried back to my car, my pulse pounding in my ears. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them, figures in uniform standing silently at the edge of the field, watching me leave. That night, as I lay in my hotel room, the events of the day replayed in my mind. I had come to the battlefield seeking answers, but instead, I had found something far more unsettling. The spirits of Ravenswood were not just memories, they were alive, reliving their final moments in a perpetual loop of horror, and I had a feeling they were just beginning to reveal themselves to me. The following morning, I woke with a sense of dread, the previous day's experiences weighing heavily on my mind. Nevertheless, my curiosity and dedication to uncovering the past drove me back to the battlefield. The historian in me refused to let a few eerie occurrences deter my research. I arrived early, the morning fog still clinging to the ground like a shroud. The air was thick with moisture, and a heavy silence hung over the field. I decided to start at the old church, which had been used as a command post during the battle. The structure, though weathered by time, still stood proudly against the backdrop of the misty hills. As I approached the church, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, I stepped inside. The interior was dark, the stained glass windows casting muted colors across the dusty pews. I walked down the center aisle, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. At the front of the church, I found a large wooden table that had served as the command center. Maps and documents, now yellowed and brittle, were scattered across its surface. I carefully examined them, trying to piece together the movements and strategies of the troops. Suddenly, a cold draft swept through the room, extinguishing the few rays of sunlight filtering through the windows. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me. Then I heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping like the sound of a drum. My heart raced as I turned toward the source of the noise. In the shadows at the back of the church, I saw them, ghostly figures, soldiers in their uniforms, marching in place. Their faces were gaunt, eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. They moved in unison, their ghostly forms barely disturbing the air around them. The tapping grew louder, and I realized it was the sound of their ghostly boots striking the floor. Transfixed, I watched as the scene played out before me. The soldiers seemed to be preparing for battle, their expressions a mix of determination and fear. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they vanished, leaving me standing alone in the cold, empty church. I stumbled out of the church, my mind reeling. The line between the past and present was blurring, and I was caught in the middle. Determined to understand what was happening, I decided to visit the nearby cemetery, where many of the fallen soldiers had been laid to rest. The cemetery was a somber place, the tombstones worn and weathered by time. I walked among the graves, reading the names and dates etched into the stone. As I paused by a particularly elaborate monument, I felt a sudden drop in temperature. My breath fogged the air, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. A low moan echoed through the cemetery, followed by the sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel path. I turned, expecting to see another visitor, but the cemetery was empty. The moaning grew louder, and I could make out the words, cries for help, for mercy, for relief from the agony of their wounds. Desperation clawed at me, but I forced myself to stay, to listen. The voices told stories of bravery and sacrifice, of comrades fallen and battles lost. Each word was a testament to the suffering endured on this hallowed ground. Suddenly, a figure materialized in front of me, a soldier, his uniform torn and bloodied, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and gratitude. He reached out to me, and for a moment I felt the weight of his sorrow and the depth of his sacrifice. Then he was gone, leaving me alone with the echoes of his final words. I returned to my car, my mind racing with questions. What had I unleashed? Why were the spirits revealing themselves to me? And most importantly, what did they want? As I drove back to my hotel, the sun setting behind me, I knew one thing for certain. I was now a part of the story of Ravenswood, and the spirits would not rest until their tales were fully told. By the third day, the boundary between my research and the spectral world of Ravenswood had become increasingly fragile. Determined to uncover the deeper secrets of the battlefield, I sought out the help of local historian and folklorist Martha Collins. Her family had lived in the area for generations, and she possessed an extensive knowledge of the legends and stories that surrounded Ravenswood. We met at a small cafe in town. Martha, a woman in her late 60s with a kind face and piercing blue eyes, listened intently as I recounted my experiences. She nodded thoughtfully, occasionally interjecting with details about the battle and the soldiers who fought there. Ravenswood has always been a place of restless spirits, she said. The battle was so fierce, so brutal, that the souls of the soldiers couldn't find peace. They're trapped, reliving their final moments over and over again. Her words sent a chill down my spine. Is there anything I can do to help them? Martha sighed. The spirits want to be heard, they want their stories told, their sacrifices remembered. You've become their conduit, their link to the living world. If you can document their experiences, perhaps they can finally find peace. That evening, I returned to the battlefield with renewed determination. The sun was sinking below the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. Armed with my recorder, notebook, and camera, I walked toward the heart of the battlefield, the site where the fighting had been most intense. As darkness fell, the temperature plummeted, and a dense fog rolled in. I could barely see a few feet in front of me. The stillness was oppressive, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. I reached a large oak tree, its gnarled branches twisted like skeletal fingers against the sky. This tree had been a prominent landmark during the battle, a place where many soldiers had fallen. I set up my equipment, hoping to capture any signs of the spirits. The night wore on, and the silence grew heavier. Suddenly a sharp cry pierced the air. I spun around, heart pounding, and saw a spectral figure emerge from the fog. It was a young soldier, barely more than a boy, his face contorted in pain. He stumbled toward me, clutching his side, blood seeping through his fingers. I reached out instinctively, but my hand passed through him. He looked at me, eyes filled with a desperate plea. "Help me," he whispered, before collapsing to the ground and vanishing. Before I could recover, more figures appeared, a spectral army marching through the fog. They moved silently, their faces etched with the horrors of war. I watched in stunned silence as they relived their final moments, fighting, falling, and fading away. Then a commanding voice broke through the chaos. "Hold the line!" A tall officer materialized before me, his uniform pristine despite the spectral bloodstains. He looked directly at me, his gaze piercing. "You must tell our story. The world must know." I nodded, overwhelmed by the weight of their collective sorrow and resolve. The officer saluted, and with that, the spectral army dissolved into the night. I stood alone in the darkness, my recorder still running, capturing the final echoes of the spirits of Ravenswood. I knew then that my mission was clear. I had to document their stories, give voice to their pain, and ensure that their sacrifices were never forgotten. As I packed up my equipment, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The spirits had entrusted me with their legacy, and I would honor that trust. The journey ahead would be arduous, but I was no longer afraid. The echoes of war would be heard, and the spirits of Ravenswood would finally find peace. The final day of my journey began with a sense of purpose and solemnity. I had spent the previous night transcribing my recordings, poring over the voices and images I had captured. Each story, each face, was a piece of a larger puzzle, a testament to the human cost of war and the unyielding spirit of those who had fought at Ravenswood. I returned to the battlefield at dawn, the sky painted with hues of pink and gold. The morning air was crisp and clear, a stark contrast to the fog and shadows of the previous nights. I felt a sense of clarity as I walked through the dew-covered grass, my footsteps the only sound in the tranquil landscape. My destination was a small knoll at the center of the battlefield, where the final stand of the Union forces had taken place. It was here that the battle had reached its bloody crescendo, and it was here that I hoped to find the final pieces of the story. As I approached the knoll, I saw a group of spectral figures gathered, their forms translucent in the morning light. Unlike the chaotic scenes I had witnessed before, these spirits stood in solemn silence, their faces calm and resolute. They seemed to be waiting for something or someone. I set up my equipment, my hands steady despite the weight of the moment. As I began to speak into the recorder, recounting the history of the final stand, the spirits moved closer, their eyes fixed on me. I could feel their collective presence, a palpable force that seemed to transcend time and space. One figure stepped forward, a young officer with a distinguished air. His uniform was immaculate, and his eyes shone with a mixture of pride and sorrow. He saluted, and I returned the gesture, feeling an inexplicable connection to this long-departed soldier. "Tell our story," he said, his voice clear and unwavering. "Let the world know of our sacrifice and our hope. We fought not just for victory, but for a future free from the horrors of war. Our time has passed, but the lessons of our struggle must endure." I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. "I will," I promised. "Your stories will be told, and your sacrifices remembered." The officer smiled, a fleeting expression of gratitude and peace. As he stepped back, the spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the morning mist. The air seemed to lighten, the oppressive weight lifting as they departed. I stood alone on the knoll, the echoes of their voices lingering in the stillness. The battlefield, once a place of blood and sorrow, now felt like hallowed ground, a testament to the enduring spirit of those who had fought and fallen here. Returning to my car, I felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The spirits of Ravenswood had entrusted me with their legacy, and I had honored that trust. The journey ahead would be one of reflection and remembrance, a continuation of the work I had begun here. As I drove away, the sun rose higher, casting a warm glow over the landscape. The battlefield, once shrouded in darkness and fear, now seemed bathed in light and hope. The echoes of war had been heard, and the spirits of Ravenswood had found peace. The stories of their sacrifice would live on, a timeless reminder of the human cost of conflict and the enduring power of memory. And as I returned to my work, I knew that I would carry the lessons of Ravenswood with me, a guiding light in my journey as a historian and a witness to the past.